year-end closing of Sage 100, thinking about that with the year-end coming up pretty quickly. So we're going to kind of go through some practical thoughts around that process and what kind of happens to do that. So our agenda today is why we're going to run year-end, where it's performed at, kind of planning for it up front, creating an archive and a backup before you make that happen. The module year-end processing order, that's a common question. What order do we do that in the system? Some year-end tips and FAQs, things we've kind of got repeated questions on. And then some small compliance updating around, especially around payroll and what we need to do, make sure it's there, and then open Q&A. So let's talk about why we need to run year-end processing. I guess, Dave, do you want to kind of cover what the main reason for closing the periods in the year?
Yeah. So, there's really three reasons to run period end processing. And, we're calling this year end processing. I mean, it's really, period end processing, year end processing. It's sort of the same thing in Sage. It's just that when you get to the last period in your fiscal year and you run the period end process, that's also considered year end processing. So they're really kind of the same tasks within Sage, but there's really three things that happen when you run a year end process in Sage. First being it closes the current accounting period. So within each module, you've got the current period and the current year that module is in. And that current period controls a lot of things in the system. And so the first thing that the year-end process does is it closes that current accounting period. And why that's important is it'll prevent users from posting a transaction to a closed period. So if, you've still got your general ledger open in, period, 12 of 2022 last year, that would give a user the ability to post to that period. So it's important to close the periods to prevent a user from posting to a period that you've already officially closed for business. So that's really item number one. Second reason is it will advance the current period in the module to the next period. So as part of the year-end process, it'll automatically advance the current period in the module to the next period in year. So it automatically happens when you run that process. And then the last thing is it does do some data purge and cleanup. So there are history retention settings in all of the modules. So number of years to retain sales history, number of years to retain general ledger history. That's all defined in the setup options for each of the modules. And so part of the year-end process, it looks at those history retention settings and it automatically does some cleanup. And the reason that's important is over time, if you've been on Sage for a number of years, you may have a lot of history in the system. If you're not running the period ends, then what tends to happen is the system slows down, especially when you're doing like inquiries or you're doing reporting. It'll have to, if you haven't run a period end, you've got a lot of history. It'll have to process through all that transactional data to generate some of those reports or some of those inquiries. So we've seen instances where I was working with a customer a couple of weeks ago that they had some turnover in their staff and they hadn't run a period end or a year end in Sage since 2017. So they had like 7 openings in Sage. And what kind of initiated the question to us was they were running like an accounts receivable aging report, and it literally was taking like 15 minutes to generate the report. Well, part of the year-end process is to clean up that open invoice file. Since that hadn't been done for so long, it was taking that report a number of minutes to generate. We got them caught up by running the year-end processes, and that report now generates in like about 60 seconds. So much quicker process. So it does do some, the cleanup of the data. And so that's something that, you want to pay attention to when you're running the process. I'm going to share my screen and take you in and show you some of what we're talking about here. So first thing we talked about was closing the current period and kind of where that's tracked in the system. So within each module, and I'm in the general ledger module, but within each module, you've got options for the module. So if you go to the setup task in general ledger options, and I bring that up, you're going to see that the general ledger is in fiscal year 2025 and the current period is 12. And so this is the period that the general ledger module is in. That's tracked within each module. I go down to accounts receivable. It'll be very similar. Go to the setup menu, go to accounts receivable options. There's my current fiscal year and current period for accounts receivable. So that's where the system thinks we are. So we're in period 12 of 2025. So what that affects is that current period does then affect some defaults that happen in the system. So as an example, if I go into general ledger and I pull up account maintenance, and I'm just going to look at an account, and I go over to the transactions tab to look at the transactions, you'll notice my fiscal year defaulted to 2025, even though I can go back and look at any previous period and look at any future period. The system sets the defaults based on the current period and fiscal year that module is in. If I go into inventories, as another example, it's very similar. If we go into item maintenance and I pull up an item, and I go to the transactions tab, you're going to see the transactions that I'm viewing by default are period 5 of 2025, which is the period that my inventory module is in. And so, because the system uses the current period as defaults throughout the system, it almost becomes an efficiency thing for users. If users are going into screens and always having to then see transactions that are 3 years old, even though they have the ability to find transactions that are more current, it's just kind of it's a hassle for them. It's time consuming. So in terms of efficiency, it's nice to keep your periods current. And that way, when you go into different screens throughout the system, the defaults that the system is displaying are based on current data. So that is where the defaults are set. And then one other thing I wanted to point out while we're in here is there are very good year-end, period-end checklists in the help system in Sage. So when you're in Sage, if you just go to help topics, and I'm going to go do an index search and just do a search on period end, you'll see there's a number of options that come up. And if we go down to accounts receivable period end processing, this is a real good overview of kind of like what the process does. So use period end processing to automatically perform either period end or year end based on the current period. We talked about that. It closes the current period and it increments it to the next period. And then temporary customers are cleaned up. This is some of the data retention stuff that happens. So the data is automatically, purged on your history retention settings. So these help screens are very helpful in determining like what's going to happen module by module when you run those period end processes. So they're available for all the modules. And then one other thing I wanted to show you, because we were talking about data cleanup and history retention. If I go into accounts receivable and accounts receivable options, and each of the modules will have this as well, is we've got a history tab. And you can see these are some of the history retention settings that I was talking about. Number of years to retain cash receipts history, 99. years to retain customer history, or years to retain salesperson history. So what happens is when you run the year-end process, it looks at these history retention settings to determine how much data we've got in the system, and it'll purge the data up and through that that retention setting that we've got. So before you run a year-end process, and that customer I was referring to earlier that hadn't run a year-end since 2017, we reviewed the history retention settings with them just to make sure that they weren't purging data that they actually wanted to maintain in the system. And so you want to do a quick overview of those if you haven't run your year-end process for a while, just to make sure you're not purging something that you want to keep in the system. Okay, Jeremy, we'll go to the next slide.
All right. Let me take the screen back. And you're looking at the PowerPoint slide. So thank you. I think the next topic is where year-end processing is performed at in Sage. And we know that we're going to do it by module. So where do you perform the action to do that?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, we kind of talked a little bit about this. The year-end processing happens in the same place that period-end processing happens. So there is a period-end task menu option in each module, and there's a period-end processing option on that menu. And the year-end process gets run if you're in the last fiscal period of your year. So really, you run a period end when we get to the end of the year. The period end process for that period will run, and the year end process kind of automatically happens. So it's run from the period end menu in each module.
And the fiscal year is defined inside a general ledger, correct?
Yeah, the fiscal year you're going to see actually you'll see the fiscal year in each module. So each module can have its own, not its own, but it can be in a different fiscal period and fiscal year. Yeah. So because the modules are run separate, you can have and we're going to talk about this a little bit in a future slide, but you can have modules in different periods, which isn't that uncommon. And so each module will have its own or a separate fiscal period, fiscal year that you're in.
But not a different calendar, but they could be in a different fiscal year and period, but they're going to follow the general ledger model of what is constituted as the
I got what you. Yeah, good question. I see what you're asking. Yeah, if you're on a fiscal year for tax purposes or book purposes, so you have a November 1 to October 30 fiscal year. Yeah, then the fiscal years referenced in the subsidiary modules, anything other than general ledger, relate to the fiscal year calendar as defined in the general ledger module.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think, is it required? How do you, we can have them in different periods, but is it required?
Yeah. So most of the modules have a year-end or period-end process that you run. Most of the transactional modules will have it. So general ledger, accounts receivable, accounts payable, sales order, inventory purchase order, they have period-end processing tasks. And they all have to be run separately. It would be very nice if they had one place in the system where you could run the period end, year end process for all the modules. Unfortunately, you have to run them for each module, kind of one at a time. There are a handful of transactional modules that don't have a period end task. Like if you're using the bill of material module, the work order module, the RMA module, bank reconciliation does not have a period end, year end task. And those are really transactional modules. So they don't have a period end, year end task, but all the other transactional modules do. And then obviously your, efficiency modules like custom office and that type of thing, they don't have a period end, year end. And then there's one kind of other exception to that. If you're using the payroll module, that actually is a quarter end process. So since payroll is handled quarterly, you don't have to run it for each month. And then, at the end of the year, you're actually running a quarter end process at the end of every quarter.
Perfect. So when we think about planning for the year-end process, what are some of the things that we're looking to accomplish?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the big thing is you want to, it's a process that we run in the system just to close that period and, do the things we talked about. And so you want to run it when you've closed the books for the year, right? So you want to make sure you've processed all the transactions you're going to process for December 2024 or 2023, I'm sorry, before we run the year-end process for 2023. So you want to make sure that the books are closed, all the transactions for the period have been processed in the system, and you've run all the reports, right? So this is really just kind of a system function that happens after you do your year-end book close process, whatever that is, and you've published the financial statement and printed all the reports that you're gonna print. The other thing about it is you want to run the process off hours. You can't run it while users are in transacting in the system, obviously, because of what the system is doing, especially with the data cleanup. So you want to schedule to run it off hours. The other thing about it is you want to do it when all your batches have been updated. So, like an invoice, sales invoice batch or an AP invoice batch, those open transaction batches should be updated. If you attempt to run a period end, year end process in a module and you have an open transaction batch, in most cases, it'll warn you that you've got an open transaction batch, but it will allow you to run the period end, year end. So, and the reason you want to post those is because, if you have an open invoice batch that has invoices from December of 2023 in it, and you run the year end for 2023, and then you try to post that batch, it's not going to let you. It's not going to let you post transactions to a closed period. And so then you have to go back in and reopen the period for the module. So best practice is, update all the open transaction batches. If you get a warning message that you've got an open batch, just make sure that gets posted, and then schedule to run the process off hours. And typically what you're going to find is, the process itself, the computer time it takes to run the process is literally minutes. I mean, if you have a kind of a normal set of modules, maybe you're closing 6 modules for one period, you probably can get through that in 15 or 20 minutes. It doesn't take a lot of computer time. Obviously, if you have a larger database or you have a number of our customers have multiple entities, multiple companies in their Sage system, that can take more time. And because you're doing it off hours, it's not ideal, but it really does not take that much time to sit down and just run through the process once you get all the users out of the system.
Yeah, and I assume if you're closing up from 2017 coming up to 2023, you might take some time.
Yeah, there's some tricks around that. I mean, what we had them do is we had them, rather than close each individual month, we had them just jump to period 12 for each previous fiscal year and just run it one time. Because there's really no, in the old versions, if you've been on Sage for a long time, there were some roll forward things that happened that you really couldn't do that. But now in the newer versions, and when I say newer, I mean anything back, to 2015, I think, when they moved everything to the new Forex framework. It's not as critical for those roll forwards. And so you can kind of, if you get way behind in your year ends, we can catch you up quickly just by going to the last period of the fiscal year. So it kind of cuts some time off that way. Yeah.
All right. So when we think about creating a backup and archive, what are some of the highlights there? And I know you're going to show a little bit how to do that, but
yeah, So we definitely recommend creating an archive or backup company, especially like for this customer I was working with. We like to do that just in the rare instance because they hadn't run the process for so long. If there were any hiccups in that process, we'd like to have a backup. So that's kind of the first reason. If you haven't done it for a long time, I mean, you're managing a lot of data potentially when it goes through those files and does its cleanup and purge. And so to have a backup, if something were to happen in the process or you've got some bad data, never a bad idea. So that would be one consideration. The other consideration is, because you're purging some history potentially, it's nice to have that data in another company, an archive company, so that you could go reference that data. So if you were doing some cleanup and you were getting rid of sales history from 5 years ago, let's say, you might want to have that in a second backup or archive company in Sage so that you could go back and reference it. We're cleaning it up out of the production company to speed up performance of the system, but at the same time, we've got it retained in a backup company if we wanted to go back and get that. And by the way, creating, and I'm going to show you how to do this, but creating a company copy in Sage is really the same process that we use for doing backups. It's great to have a test company in your Sage system. A lot of our customers has test companies. They can go in and test process a transaction, just see how it's going to post up through the system. And so really the process of creating this backup or archive company is identical to what we use to create a test company. So, and the test companies are always good to have. The company copies are done in Library Master Company Maintenance, and I'm going to show you that here in just a second. And I guess the last comment on this slide that is related, not directly related, but we wanted to talk about. We highly recommend that you test your backup every now and again. And we had a situation 2 weeks ago, Jeremy, and it seems like this comes up every year where we had a customer call in and they had inadvertently updated a payroll that wasn't correct, and wanted to unwind it. It got pretty messy pretty quickly. And the easiest thing was going to be to restore from a backup. And everybody's backing up their systems, right? Everybody has some way that they're backing up. And whether that's your IT vendor taking care of that for you, your IT department, we all think we're getting good backups. And easiest fix for this customer would have been to just restore from the previous night's backup to rerun that payroll. And they went back and found out that the backup they thought they didn't have, and it hadn't been successfully backing up for, I think it was like 8 or 9 months. And so it's just always a good idea to just test that you are getting a backup. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to actually test restore, make sure you can get the database or the data files back down to the server in the event that you were to have some kind of issue that we would have to recover from. So not directly related to really creating backups inside of Sage, but we just wanted to, mention that because it seems like it comes up on a regular enough basis, and it can't put you in a bad spot, obviously. So.
Yeah, when you think they're happening and they're not really. I think the other one that we had not too long ago was company got hit with a cyber attack and a ransomware deal, and they went to the easiest thing for them was let's go to a backup and get the most recent good copy without the ransomware, and they found out again they didn't have a good backup, so they're they end up paying the ransom is what it came down to.
Yeah.
So testing that at least annually is a good practice to get into.
Yeah, it's crazy how often it's happened. I mean, in our world, right? I mean, I feel like we're talking about this every 6 months here at Matrix, where we've got somebody that needed to recover from a backup and couldn't. Maybe not 6 months, but every year it comes up, and so something to think about. I'm going to share out my screen and show you how we would do a company copy. So we're at the end of the year. Before we run the year-end process, we know we're going to be the system's going to purge some data. So I'm just going to create a backup of my production company. I'm in this ABC demo company. A backup is done in Library Master Company Maintenance. And the way that's done is These are all the companies that are currently in my database. The first thing we have to do is create a 3-digit company code. So I'm just going to call this backup. A lot of times our customers will use like the first digit of, their company code and then the year. So, this could be the backup for 23 or something like that, right? We'll do it that way. Company code B23. So this is our backup for 2023 before we run the year-end process. Something's nice in the newer versions of Sage is they now allow you to identify a company type. We didn't used to have that. And so we've seen systems that have literally 27 different companies in them, and you're not sure which are the production companies and what are the backup companies and what are the test companies. And so now we can identify a company type, whether it's live, archive, demo, and test. And then when a user goes to log in, they can see what that company type is. The other thing that this does do, there's now some security that prevents like a user from overwriting a live company, right? And this has happened too. I mean, there is a way to create a copy from the source company to the backup company, and you don't want to go the wrong way because you could be overwriting your production company. So there's some permissions now in the newer versions that, based on this company type, control what a user can do. So kind of nice. So I'm going to call this an archive company because this is the backup company. And I first have to define the company. So now I've created the company code and I have to accept that. And once I do, I can go back into that company and then I click on the copy button right here. So the important thing to note is you go into the company that you're going to copy to, not the company you're going to copy from. So I'm in the company I'm going to copy to, which is my backup company. I'm going to click on the copy button. It's going to tell me I'm about to create copy over an archive company, which I know I defined that as an archive company, and I have the permissions to do this. It's going to ask me if I want to proceed. I say yes, and then it's going to ask me for the source company. So this is the company I'm copying from, which is my demo company here. This is my production company. Okay, so I'm copying from dem into B23. And then you can do individual modules. So it allows you to say, well, all I want is common information, general ledger, but I don't, down through AP, but I don't really care about inventory. I don't recommend you do that, but you can do that. So we select the modules we want to copy, click the proceed button, just ask me if I want to copy all the data files to the selected company. I say yes, it goes through this process, and it doesn't really take that long. This is a demo database, so there's not a lot of data in it, but even in larger systems, we see that, this probably can be accomplished in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. This is another thing that I'd recommend you do off hours. It's not a great idea if you're trying to create a backup company, if you've got users in transacting in the middle of the day, because there's no good cutoff, right? So best practice is just get to the end of the day, get everybody out and make this backup. And now we've got the B23 company that's got all of the modules with its data captured. And I would be at a point now where if I needed to recover or go back and look at historical data, I would have that. All right.
Yeah, that's a great, the test company is something we use often. And when you're doing a big process, maybe a physical inventory, or you're doing something that maybe has a big impact, you might want to copy the test company over, kind of get a refresh, and then walk through that process one time, see what the variance is doing, see what the posting does, and then when you feel good, you do it in the live. So it's a great tool at your fingertips to do those things.
That's such a great point because, there are some nice utilities in Sage to delete, inventory items and things that are like big data processes inside of Sage that can take some time. And to your point, Jeremy, you want to see the result before you just kick this process off. So yeah, I always recommend it if you're going to do something large like that we do it in a test company.
Yeah, I'm about to do that with a client. They have about 9,000 open PO orders and they want to purge a good set of them. So we'll do it in a test company, let them review it, and then decide whether it's the right move.
Yeah.
All right, very cool. So let's share. All right, so our next topic is the order that we close modules, and the rule of thumb, I'll let you talk about it, but the rule of thumb is from the bottom up. But
yeah. So what Sage recommends is, you close modules from the bottom of the launcher to the top. And so if you look at the order we've got here, purchase order, sales order, inventory down through general ledger, and then you look at your Sage launcher, which we can look at in a minute, we're actually starting at the bottom of the module tree and working our way up. The reason that's recommended is because you want to, and we have customers that will close, like, some of the more detailed modules, the last business day of the month, but they want to leave like accounts receivable open for a couple days while they reconcile, that type of thing. And because each module is closed separately, you can do that. You wouldn't want, you want to close the modules at the bottom because they post to modules going up the tree. Like the purchase order module posts to inventory, and it posts it to accounts payable, and it posts up to the general ledger module. The sales order module posts to accounts receivable, and it posts to inventory, and it posts up to the general ledger module. So if you were to run the period end or the year end for, the accounts payable module first, and you had that in 2024, but your PO module was still in 2023, and someone posted a transaction into 2023, it wouldn't allow it to post up through accounts payable because that's already closed. And so it's not really required. If you do it in reverse order, it's not going to break anything. It's just a recommendation if you're going to maintain your modules in different periods, that you start at the bottom of the tree and work your way up. And so that's really kind of what you're what you're seeing on this tree. If you do them all, if you do them all at the same time, it doesn't matter. Work top to bottom or bottom to top. It doesn't really matter. A couple other, I guess, points on this slide, and we talked about this on a previous slide, but there's no period end or year end processing task for bill of material, work order, RMA, bank rec. That's why you're not seeing them on this listing. But if you use those modules, you want to make sure that you've processed all the transactions in those modules through whatever period you're going to close. So if you use bill of material, that does write up to inventory. And even though there's no, period end process, year end process and bill of material, you want to make sure you've entered all your production entries in bill of material for the month of December before you start closing the month of December in inventory, because here again, it won't allow you to post to those other modules because they're integrated. So no period end on those, but make sure you're done with all your work in those modules. So there are some other tasks on the period end menu, and we're going to show you here in a minute, but there are some other tasks on the period end menu within the modules that are period end tasks that should already be done at the point that you get to, actually running the year end period end task inside of Sage. Things like if you use commissions, the commission reporting and accounts receivable is on the period end menu. So there are some other tasks that are on that period end menu that should be run. They just put them on at this point, but they just put them on that menu kind of as a reminder. Hey, before you run the period end, make sure you've kind of done all these other things and tied everything out. So other point on this is there's an option when you run period end, year end processing to print the period end reports. We just recommend that you don't do that, because here again, at this point, you've closed your books, you've run your financial statements, you've run all of if you run an AR trial balance and an AP trial balance and an inventory valuation at the end of the month as support for your general ledger balances, that should all be done. This is just kind of a formality in the system. And so to just generate that paper as part of the process, I've never really understood why they put that where that's at. Your report should be printed at this point in time. So we just recommend that you just deselect that when you run the process. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Share my screen. All right, so we're back in our demo system, and I'm going to just start with, keep it simple, we'll go to accounts receivable. So within the accounts receivable menu, you can see I've got my period end menu here. And this is really what I was referring to with those other tasks. So in accounts receivable, maybe you use finance charges, you print customer statements, you use the commission reporting process. All these other things should be done at this point in time, but they're there just as a reminder that, they're kind of part of what you would normally do as you close the books for the period. So I'm in accounts receivable, I go to period end. This is actually then where the process is run, period end processing. And I wanted to show you this. This is an example of a warning message that you're going to get, but it's going to allow me to continue to run this process. So that's just telling me that I've got unposted invoices in sales order invoicing. Here again, the reason that's important is if I'm trying to close the, trying to close the year for 2023, and I've got some invoices in the sales order module for 2023. I want to update those before I run this. Otherwise, I will not be able to update them without reopening the module. So you can see I click OK. It's still going to allow me to do it, but it just gave me the warning. So when we get to this screen, other thing I wanted to point out, it's going to tell you what period it's going to close. So my accounts receivable period and year-end processing will be performed for period 12. My accounts receivable module is in period 12 of 2025. So it's just confirming, hey, you're going to be running the period and the year-end process because that's the last period of the fiscal year for 12 of 2025. This is the period end reports option that I was referring to. So I would just recommend you turn that off. You click proceed. It's going to ask me again. It's going to say, hey, period 12. It's going to be changed automatically to period 1 of 2026. Have you done everything that you needed to do? Do you want to complete it? I say yes, and that's it. That's literally how quickly the process runs. And then what's happened kind of behind the scenes is it took care of the data, the history purge, anything that it needed to clean up in terms of history retention. And if I go into accounts receivable options now, it's automatically advanced the current fiscal year to 2026 and the current period to period 1. So that automatically happens behind the scenes. Now you can't process transactions into period 12 of 2025. All right. Back to you, Jeremy.
All right. And post back to. All right. So we learned the modules. Let's go into some kind of year-end tips. So the first one is in regards to GL closing. That's tends to be a little different.
Yeah, it's actually the same process. I guess the note here is it's not unusual to leave the general ledger open beyond the subsidiary modules, just waiting on final adjustments. So if you're at your year end and you've booked all your AR, AP transactions and you want to move into 2024, it's fine to run the year-end process for those subsidiary modules and just leave the general ledger open until you get the final. I don't recommend that you run the year-end on the general ledger if you're waiting for adjustments because you just got to reopen it to book those adjustments, and that's not unusual. So recommendation there is just close all the other modules, leave general ledger open until you've got what you need to close that out for the year, and then you can run the general ledger close. The other bullet point here is payroll. If you're using payroll, you're always on a calendar year for payroll. Even if your company's on a fiscal year, the payroll module is set up so that you're always on a calendar year. And like we said earlier, you're running quarter ends within the payroll module rather than the monthly period ends within the subsidiary module.
So one thing I always have to remind myself, Dave, is if your GL is in December and you've moved AR or sales order up to January, can you post a batch in AR back to December, or is it gonna lock you from doing that?
Yeah, it's gonna lock you from doing that.
Okay, so even though the GL is back that month, the AR is gonna move forward.
Yeah.
So it'll prevent you from doing that. So that's good.
Yeah. So really, I mean, like we said earlier, you don't really want to run the process until you've kind of finalized all your transactions in that subsidiary module. You know, in the general ledger, yeah, leave that open for general ledger adjusting entries, but you know, the assumption is you've gotten through all the detailed transactions in those subsidiary modules before you run that process.
And the other thing is there is no preventing of posting forward. So it's never gonna hold you back from posting into a future period. It would only prevent you from posting in backwards.
That is a good. There is a. I'm going to get the answer. There is now a. I think it's either a permissions setting or it's a preference in the system that can prevent a user. You can prevent a user from posting to a future period. Kind of. Yeah, they've added that. You know, the issue with that, and I got to find out where it is, but the issue with that, because I don't know off the top of my head without looking for it, but
yeah.
Issue with that is if you're not current in running your period ends, then you're kind of preventing users from doing what you need them to do, right? So, and I think if I'm not, yeah, go ahead.
That could get really messy at the end of the month if that's I could see that being messy.
Yeah.
It would definitely, it would definitely make you not force you, but definitely make you be more up to date on getting that process run.
Yep.
But in the normal sense, up until that feature has been added, you've always been able to post forward. You just can't post back.
You know what? Yeah, I'm going to find that if we get a few minutes here at the end. I'll see if I can run that down because that's a good question, and I think there's some restriction on that now.
All right, so kind of to a couple of our frequently asked questions, can I print a financial statement for the next fiscal year prior to performing year-end processing?
Yeah. They're in the older versions that sometimes became an issue because of the roll forward that we were talking about. But you know, you can, if your general ledger's still open in 2023 and you get to the end of January 2024, then yes, you can print a financial statement for January. You don't want to go in and change the current period in the general ledger options to do that. When the report screen comes up, it'll just default to it'll default to the period that it's going to run the statement for, and you can just click on the next period and run it for that period going forward. So there really are no restrictions on printing financial statements. You can print them for any previous year, any future year, regardless of what period your general ledger module is in.
Good. All right, after year-end processing, can I delete accounts that will no longer be used in the fiscal year and still run comparison statements?
Yeah, you cannot do that. Well, you don't want to do that. I mean, the general ledger information for prior fiscal years is stored by that account number. And so if you delete an account number, now we can't create a comparative financial. Matter of fact, it's difficult to even do it. I mean, there's a lot of controls that prevent that from happening. So best thing to do is if you want to no longer use some accounts, but you still want to have them available for comparative financial reporting, is just to inactivate them. So if you're on a current version of Sage, then in account maintenance, there's a status drop down that allows you to set an account as inactive. And what that means is if a user goes to book an entry to that account, you can either prevent that through permissions or at least warn them that the account is inactive. So you're preventing somebody from posting to an inactive account, but retaining that transaction history for comparative financial reporting purposes.
Yeah, and ultimately, when you go down to the subsidiary ledgers in AR, you can't get rid of a customer that has historical data.
Yeah.
Once you're past that historical period, you can get rid of them, but you might have that set to 5 years or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, right. It's always better if you can inactivate things. It's difficult and really, like you said, accounts receivable for customers, payable for vendors, inventory for inventory items. I mean, there are now, statuses to set items, customers, vendors, accounts as inactive, and then you don't have to see them in your lookups and report on them and that kind of thing. But you're retaining the history of those items that way.
Right. All right. So the second to last question: can I process year-end in GL before I finish the other modules?
Yeah, no, you would not want to do that. Back to our conversation about all the other modules, transactional modules, post up through the general ledger. And so that the general ledger would be the very last module that you'd run the period end on.
And then assuming we close the module and then we come up with something we need to post backwards, can we reopen that module?
Yeah, you can actually reopen a closed module. It's very simple to do. You just go into the options for the module and you change the current fiscal period and the current fiscal year back to the period that you need to post the transaction to. You then enter the transaction and then you go back into options for that module and you just change the fiscal year and the fiscal period and the fiscal year back. So there's no need to rerun the process inside a Sage, the year-end period end process. You're literally just changing the period to the period you need to close, book the entry to, update the entry, and then just change the period back. So very simple process.
Because ultimately you've already done the purge and cleaning of data, so there's no reason to run that process.
Yeah. In the old versions, I was going to show this, but I'm not going to do that just because my general ledger's not right. But in the older versions where we had those roll forwards, it was a little bit different of a process. But now in the new version, because you really can be in any period and we're retaining the history by those periods. There's it's literally just change the fiscal period and year to the period that you want to book the entry to, book it, and then just change it back. That's really what's involved in doing that.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about compliance. This really lays its hands on payroll more than anything else.
Yeah. So in terms of year-end compliance updates from Sage, in years past, we've had what they call IRDs, which are year-end program changes to accommodate 1099 changes or W-2 changes, that kind of thing. There is no year-end IRD, which is good news. So there's nothing that's going to need to be done in terms of an installation for year-end. Couple exceptions to that. If you're using Atrix for W-2 reporting for payroll or 1099 reporting through accounts payable, then there are some minimum version requirements you need to be on in order for Atrix to function. So if you're on, you can kind of just read down through this slide, but if you're on 2021, 2022, 2023, you're good. We're going to have a year-end Atrix update that'll automatically install as part of the process, and you'll be able to print your W-2 and 1099 forms through Atrix. If you're on Sage 2020 up through product update 6, there is going to be a hot fix in order to use Atrix reporting. So in that case, you're on an older version. You're technically that 2022 version is no longer supported, even though Sage still issued this year-end fix, but it's technically no longer supported by Sage. So we would need to install a hot fix to use the Atrix reporting. So check on that. If you use 1099s or W-2s, we should be fine. All of our customers that use payroll, I don't believe we've got anybody on 2020, but if 1099s we're not as clear on, because we have a lot of customers that do 1099s, we're not involved in that. You'll want to see if you're on 2020, we might need a hot fix. If you're on a version prior to that, we're going to have to figure something else out. The only other comment there is there is going to be a payroll 2024 at some point. I don't think we've seen that yet. So it's a new version of payroll. That's not required to get through the 2023 year end. It's just going to be available. And so no requirement to install that in preparation of the year end, but there is going to be a new version of payroll 2024. That's it on compliance then, Jeremy.
Excellent. All right, I think that's bringing us to the end. So we've got a few minutes left for a question and answer. So certainly if you need help, you can call us or you can email myself or Dave or Nate or Larry, and we'll get back to you.